Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Kirk. I'm with David Frank. And just before Thanksgiving, we're discussing national politics of the day. And we're going to start with Tom Homan, who was in the previous administration, Trump administration, who basically came up the ranks and will be, this time, the border czar. Now, the border czar is not a real position. The Vice President Harris had been dubbed the border czar before. She protested that, didn't want to be that. It was part of what was used against her in the campaign. But he is going to be apparently in charge of deporting illegal aliens and guarding the borders northwest, south, and at the ports. And the reason he's getting a made-up position rather than an official title is he won't have to go through a Senate confirmation hearing. If he can, apparently the president can just create positions and appoint them, and that is happening in several occasions this time around. For instance, Trump says that he's going to appoint Musk and Vivek jointly as the head of the Department of Government Efficiency. There is, of course, no such department, but at any rate, this is what's happening. So now we are going to have a border czar. He's not going to be in the Department of the Interior or the head of ICE or anything like that. He is going to be the border czar, and he is talking tough. Basically, he says that he anticipates all the lawsuits. He's going to file lawsuits to, he's not going to have the authority. He's going to instruct the appropriate people to file lawsuits to overturn the sanctuary cities. I don't know why he thinks those lawsuits are going to work this time when they failed in the past. Maybe one of these shows before he comes, we can go over why sanctuary cities are perfectly legal and do not interfere with federal processes, at least the way most of them are written. But he is also threatening to send the mayor of Denver to jail. The mayor of Denver said, we're going to do what we can to protect immigrants. And he walked back the extent to what he said. But still, there is this threat to jail a mayor, a duly elected mayor. So certainly in the rhetoric, it's authoritarian. Will it be in the practice? What kind of power will this guy actually have? Well, if Trump basically follows his advice and Trump issues instructions to the various departments, then he is the border czar. As long as Trump agrees with his proposals. Trump is sticking by his promise to mass deport 15 million people who are here illegally. He is also, we'll discuss in our third segment, threatening to revoke birthright citizenship by executive order, basically override the 14th Amendment by executive order. And we'll discuss that in the third one. But Tom Homan is a hawk on this issue, and he is threatening Democrats, wants to get rolling. He basically wants to initiate a war on immigration, or at least what they determine to be illegal immigration and inappropriately granted citizenship. Dave, what do you have?
Yeah, thank you for that setup, as always. I think this is a really interesting case because we do have a little bit of a track record here of Tom Homan from when he was the acting director of the agency, the ICE agency, Immigration Customs Enforcement. So back before the current political climate, back when Trump was in office, he was really in a sort of a belligerent position, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I just mean his tone, his style, his rhetoric with Congress, where they were asking him about the child separation policy, and it was like Pramila Jayapal and AOC, I think, were the two people that were asking him questions, and he was yelling at them like, "Hey, I'm a citizen. You work for me." which is pretty interesting starting point, right? But he was basically saying that they were criminals. People that came across were criminals, and the Democratic pushback was that a person seeking asylum is not a criminal. So I think that's like a fundamental high level starting point for this conversation about the present. Defining big picture, defining, what is a criminal here when it comes to immigration, what constitutes a national security threat. So much of the election process, we heard former president and President-elect Trump basically saying that there are many criminals within the population of the 10 plus million people that have immigrated here but not gotten legal documentation status. But the question is, how true is that? How many of those people are there? We know there are criminals in any given population, and the horrific stories reverberate. And I think universally people want to assess and address and engage and deal with that. But there's a war of rhetoric going on right now. So, for example, Holman was on Fox over the weekend, interviewed by, I forgot his first name, Mark Levin. And he said, we are going to enforce the law, period. And they are not going to stop us. And he's talking about Democratic governors and Democratic mayors. And he pointed out that he named the code part of Title VIII. I think he said 1324 III. That's what I thought I heard him say, U.S. Immigration Code. And he said that's a felony if you knowingly harbor and conceal an illegal alien from immigration authorities. Those were his words. And he also said disobeying a direct order from a federal ICE agent is a felony. So that's the lean he's taking. He's saying, look, he was a former New York police officer, and he knows that if there's a DWI going on and the driver is drunk and there's a child in the car, the child gets separated from the family, for example. That was the example he gave in the past. He's saying, just because it's upsetting that we're talking about disruption to families, that's not going to change their approach. And he said, I'll continue this line real quickly. He said, quote, "You are absolutely breaking the law," talking about, if the governor of Colorado or the mayor of Denver, if either of those people were to say, I think he was referring specifically to the Denver mayor here, and he said, there's one thing that me and the Denver mayor have in common, we agree on. He's willing to go to jail and I'm willing to put him in jail. So that rhetoric that you described, like the whole point of this is that they're saying they're laying down the gauntlet, that there will be consequences. And we could talk a little bit more about the role of the military, the division of labor, the prioritization. But just one last thing, the governor, Abbott from Texas, is saying that he wants to declare this an invasion, and that right. That would start the dialogue around the national security threat aspect of this issue.
It also might have impact birthright citizenship, if it could be called that, but we'll talk about that later. And it's a lame argument, but anyway, let's just give a little bit of history too, because he was not initially did not rise in the ranks under Trump. He actually rose under Obama. He worked for the INS before it was broken down into ICE and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. You've got ICE, the enforcement, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and then you've got the Immigration Services, and they separated the two, which is a little. There's a little bit of a controversy around that, but he's been a cop since 1983, or actually was until 1983. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Obama actually deported more people proportionally in the time he was in office than Trump did. And you can talk about why. Some people would argue it's because he's more efficient at running government. But Tom Homan was a factor in that. He had in the second term in 2013, more than 432,000 people, the biggest of any year, by the way, of any time, were deported, and that was. And then Obama actually gave him in 2015 a Distinguished Presidential Rank Award, which angered a number of immigrant rights organizations and dubbed Obama the deporter in chief. So this has been kind of a bipartisan thing. But what Obama didn't do and what Trump did do at Holman's recommendation the last time around was to declare zero tolerance for crossing the border. And real quickly, it is not a crime to be a quote unquote illegal alien here. I don't use that term. I use undocumented immigrant. However, either whatever you want to call it, it is not a crime to be here. If you come here on a visa and you overstay, it is a civil legal violation, not a criminal one. If you make it through a check stop and they just don't, and the people at the border just, they can't check every car. They can't check, every individual comes through. That's just not humanly possible or technically possible. So every once in a while, maybe on their fourth or fifth try, they slip through. And famously, in one place in California, they go and they order a sandwich at McDonald's, they get the receipt, and it shows that they went through at that checkpoint. So in case there are any deportation, they can say, look, I'm not deportable on that basis because I came through and it's only a civil violation. So everybody, however, who crosses at a non-checkpoint, crosses through the river or overland, is committing a misdemeanor. The difference here is that anybody who crossed there, zero tolerance, they're supposed to be charged with a crime, not just be captured and released, but charged with a crime. And that's what led to the separation of families, because you can't keep children in jails. Anyway, so that's where we're at. So this guy is hardcore, and he's talking hardcore. A lot of people are hoping, again, that Trump won't be as radical as his rhetoric, but that hasn't been the history. So, Dave, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. One is one we'll speak to first, which is what are they actually committing to doing versus the more general rhetoric, and secondarily, what are some of the threats to governors that are vocally resisting the idea of rounding people up in some horrific Gestapo-style imagery that even Republican Senator Rand Paul said is, it's not a great idea to imagine troops rounding people up. So just to get past the rhetoric, cut through the first cut, Homan did mention, and I think it was on Hannity's show, not on Levin's show. He said, this is a quote. He said, I'll say this, President Trump has made it clear we're going to prioritize public safety threats and national security threats right out of the gate because they pose the most danger to this country. What governor or mayor doesn't want public safety threats and national security threats out of their neighborhood, out of their communities? That's their number one responsibility. So you can hate Trump all you want, but you got to love your community more than you hate President Trump. So in a way, you see they're giving up the ghost a little bit there. And also Trump's transition spokesperson, Carolyn Levitt, said that the president will marshal, there's a quote, will marshal every federal and state power necessary to institute the largest deportation operation, here it is, of illegal criminals, drug dealers, and human traffickers in American history, while simultaneously lowering costs for families. So, in a way, they're saying like, hey, there's a lot that we're projecting, but not a lot we're committing to. And also, Honan, even in his congressional testimony in the past, he said, "Look, I personally opened up trailers and saw the result of traffickers, people dying in these containers, and also, the 1 in 3 women crossing the border through smuggling operations is a victim of sexual violence, and all sorts of, he's basically saying we are protecting criminals. Misspoke. We are protecting a migrant population from the criminal gang activity, and we want to target that criminal gang activity." So there is a way that you could thread the needle here if you were a thoughtful incoming administration with this whole process. But that's issue one. Issue two is that the governors, Governor Newsom from California, Governor Pritzker from Illinois, they've said, like, look, we are taking every active measure that we can with our attorneys general and in coordination with our state level law enforcement to protect the lives of our citizens from what could potentially be federal overreach and disruption in the lives of communities. So that leads to Honan saying, "Hey, we are going to threaten we're going to threaten the funding of states," and really then that leads to, well, would they really cut law enforcement budgets? would they really cut, that would be cutting off their nose to spite their face. So we'll see if it's even legal to withhold federal funds in this tit for tat war of words that we're currently experiencing.
Yeah, I'm going to give a real quick version. Sanctuary cities are perfectly legal as long as they don't have any policy or practice that actually interferes with the federal agencies doing their job. But they are not bound to lend their jails or their or police officers, and certainly not for free, but definitely not at all. Also not at all to that. That's what sanctuary cities are. They're simply saying, do what you're going to do, federal government, but you don't count on us to help you out, as we might with other types of actions, unless it's specifically a human trafficking issue or something along those lines. But if you're just going up against people who are just here working and don't happen to have the paperwork, we're not going to help you with that. That's what sanctuary cities are. It goes back to, I encourage people to look up Prigg versus Pennsylvania, 1858 case, some years after Dred Scott, where the federal marshals were actually trying to get escaped slaves that they caught up to and use the local sheriff services and jails in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania said, we're not going to do that. They prevailed at the Supreme Court based on the 10th Amendment. It's not something that they're mandated to do. So based on that that precedent, the lawsuits against sanctuary cities have failed before. But we have a Supreme Court that seems to be willing to not ignore precedent, even their own precedent to a certain degree. So we'll see. Good evening. Okay, so apparently there's been a ceasefire agreement reached between Hezbollah and Israel, brokered by the Biden administration. People are saying that, man, maybe if he had done this back in October, there would have been different election results. But it also might be that Netanyahu just wasn't going to give Biden or Harris anything until after the election. In fact, there were a number of meetings between the Trump administration and Harris, and it's reminiscent of when Nixon's people met with Vietnamese leaders and discouraged them from participating in the peace talks to benefit the Democrats in 1968. You would think that this would be treason, but to interfere with foreign policy when you're not in the government, but nobody's going to make a big deal about it. It's just, the politics of it is basically Trump can do what he wants. But at any rate, there is apparently at least a tentative ceasefire agreement where Biden announced yesterday that there's going to be no further aggression, that Israel is going to remove its troops from Lebanon, and the fight is over there, basically. No indication of that on the other side. On the southern part of Israel. Of course, the Israeli troops don't go in and stay in at this point. They go in, blow something up, and then come out. What's going to happen with, apparently there was a story actually last night on one of the news programs that I was watching that basically said that there's going to be pressure on Egypt to create a release valve to allow Gazans to flow into Egypt. So maybe the Palestinian population size in Gaza will be half of what it is and easier to manage, and the Palestinians will be allowed to live in the two major urban areas, but travel between that will be controlled. Basically, an occupation, but maybe not seen on the streets of the two major cities. We don't know. It's all speculation at this point, but Egypt has not been willing to accept Palestinians. I mean, a few people have made it in, And as reported last night, they probably won't be able to get back into Gaza. So nothing is really happening on that front yet. I think they're going to wait to let Trump negotiate it so that it looks like Trump negotiated some kind of a peace. They'll probably appoint somebody to speak for the Palestinians, and that will be that. So anyway, thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, I kind of focused more in this instance on the actual the history context, rather, of what why is there this military force called Hezbollah in Lebanon that has 150,000 rockets that they launch on a pretty regularized schedule in solidarity with the situation that's happening with the Palestinian people in Gaza, because they have their own interests in mind. Well, it turns out that that conflict there, the UN peacekeepers have been there since 1978. So the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, they were established in 78 with up to 15,000 UN peacekeeper troops. They represent 10% of the United Nations' entire troop presence. So that region there is occupied. The border region between Lebanon and Israel is occupied by both Israeli troops and Hezbollah troops, both of which are in violation. There was a war between 82 and 2000. In 2000, Israel withdrew most of their troops. But anyway, in 2006, the reason this is important is because there's a resolution in place called 1701 from the 2006 ceasefire. In effect, what happened in this current ceasefire that just took effect is they're recommitting to that ceasefire. They're recommitting to the structure where the Lebanese military, the country's actual military, takes control of the border region so that it's a buffer, preventing Israel from having the reason to say that Hezbollah is a threat, and Hezbollah take away their reason to say that Lebanon is occupied by an occupying Israeli troops. So that's the goal. The real silver lining here is that both Israel and Hezbollah have committed to this ceasefire, because they apparently want that buffer zone. So the one it's called the blue line, which is the geographic border. But then there's also a river. That's the blue line is the southern border. I'm drawing a blank on the river right now. Apologies, but that's the north. The Litani River is the northern border of that buffer zone. So the idea really here is that Israel has really met its purpose. They've killed the leader of Hezbollah, Syed Hassan Nasrallah. They've taken out many thousands of Hezbollah fighters. If you remember the pager bombs that went off, that was a very long-standing intelligence operation to put little mini bombs in the pocket of all the Hezbollah members who stopped using mobile phones because they were tracked by Israeli intelligence. So those pagers were then sold to them by Israeli intelligence. So that's a massive, many-year-long operation that's complete. So Hezbollah still has some capacity, but they need to rebuild. They're shaken to their core. And Israel even says that they were set back by decades. But also, people are saying that Israel also needs some time to reconstitute, because they did hit Lebanon pretty heavily. So bottom line is that's the reason for the ceasefire. The question is, will it last? I have some comments on that, but I don't know if you want to talk about the current political situation before we move on to that.
Yeah, we're basically, I think that one of the reasons Netanyahu is agreeing to this is the war is starting to take a toll on the economy of Israel. It's not sustainable forever on both fronts. There were people that were saying that it was a mistake to open up the second front to begin with. So he probably needed that, and so it was probably not hard to negotiate that. Netanyahu cannot maintain the second front, and it's one thing to take out the Hamas leadership, because that was a hyper centralized organization. I imagine they're trying to adapt it to this now, but that leadership basically exerted or attempted to exert complete control over all of the operations. Hezbollah is more classically a guerrilla organization and organized along less centralized lines. So they can still fight a war. They're sending drones in. They're shooting at the IDF and exacting more of a toll than Hamas fighters have. And so it was definitely Netanyahu's interest to stop this fighting because it's because it is an actual fighting organization, not just geared towards creating terror stuff, not just lobbing rockets in that most of which will miss their target anyway, but is much more focused. They use drone attacks, and it has killed soldiers and civilians. Their primary targets have been military. And so it was definitely in Netanyahu's interest to do this. Will it hold? I mean, maybe, for a while. And there's definitely a lot of other stuff on the table that Israel has to deal with. And I don't think Netanyahu wants to give Biden all the wins. I think he wants to save and at least let Trump look like he actually accomplished something there. Good evening.
I think that agree with you. Netanyahu has second and third order goals and priorities, including like reconstituting military strength and including playing out the clock on the Biden administration so that they can engage on more favorable terms with the Trump administration, although I don't think the United States has really interfered in any significant or meaningful way with Israeli goals to date. But the perception is that Netanyahu was really, truly waiting around with the anticipation of a Trump administration giving more leeway in the regional conflict. So one thing that I think to move past that, one element of this, which is, I don't think that the ink is even really dry on how this is going to happen, but I did see a report that said that Lebanon now is planning on mobilizing 6,000 of their troops to this region, and that they're under the deal, an international monitoring committee headed by the United States is going to oversee the implementation of both Hezbollah's retreat from the border region and Israel withdrawals from occupied Lebanese territory. So in other words, real peace that has just been eluding everybody for the last over 40 years, and certainly since this 2006 ceasefire agreement. So we're talking 20 years since they've agreed to just clear out the border space. Because in reality, what empowers Netanyahu in this instance is the threat of rocket barrages coming from the north and hitting communities in the northern part of their country. So even though Hezbollah claims to have been acting in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their plight in Gaza and West Bank, in truth, they do have their own occupational, considerations for why they even have such a robust military that gets so much support from Iran. So again, this is part of that regional context of the United States' key democratic ally in the region, Israel, and the confrontation with Iran and their proxy army surrogates, Hezbollah. Hezbollah just means resistance, right? So what were they resisting? They were resisting the intervention of Israel in Lebanon. I mean, that's ultimately what we're talking about. So, a full capitulation like we had talked about, you and I talked about, I think on Saturday, when it comes to the Palestinian conflict, that's a completely different dynamic here in Lebanon. So there's a quote from one of the diplomats involved that's said the real test will be Hezbollah's withdrawal to the north side of that river. In other words, will they really do what they say they're going to do? And then secondarily, knowing the Shia community there really does blame Hezbollah for the state of Lebanon. Lebanon is a dysfunctional state right now. I don't think it's very controversial to say that they have many internal problems. But people also they rally behind Hezbollah when Israel is in direct conflict. So this really will test the country of Lebanon's ability to heal, but also will test the authenticity of Israel. Was it a real ceasefire, or is it just, like people say, it could just be a tactical pause while they rebuild and potentially, once Trump's president, engage in additional hostilities?
All right. So bringing this back to American politics, again, Ocasio-Cortez says that she asked a lot of people why people voted for both Trump and herself. And there were people that voted that were kind of on the left that said they voted for Trump because they think that it'll lead to peace in the Middle East, that Biden is for genocide and Trump is for peace. Literally, that's what some of them said. I don't know how many of them. AOC has these responses from people. And as we know, there were people in Michigan, Muslims, who voted for Trump, apparently completely forgetting about the Muslim ban under Trump. But they did it because Biden came across as extremely wimpy with regard to Netanyahu. He would say, we're trying to negotiate. And Harris repeated that. Oh, we're going to try to negotiate a peace. They should have said, we are going to put pressure, and did not do that. So I don't think it's the reason she lost the election. I mean, there's probably about 10 reasons that if they hadn't happened, would have made the difference. It turns out this is a very close election in terms of the popular vote. And a small difference could have made a difference in at least 5, if not 6, of the so-called swing states. I mean, it turned out they were real close. Trump now is down to a plurality, and I think there's about a 1.5% difference in the popular vote. Just a few more votes that way, but for whatever reason, Biden is part of the Cold War Democrats that just cannot do anything but give Israel whatever it wants, and perceived as such. It was definitely a factor. Had they been tougher on it, she might be planning her presidency right now. I'll let you close it out with the last minute.
Yeah, keep it really brief here. You and I looked a little bit at the exit polls and what topics were of primary importance to people. And foreign policy was only, 5% of the people claim that that was a key reason for their vote. But at the margins, 5% is 1 out of 20 people. And across 3 states, if the 3 battleground states, the blue wall states, which you said we shouldn't call them anymore, that's we're talking about under 250,000 votes when, tens of millions of people voted in those states. So at the margins, a more, like you said, maybe a better timing of engaging on this topic or maybe better communication strategy could, in theory, have helped the Biden-Harris team create the environment where people were inspired instead of discouraged to vote for them.
And just to remind everybody, the Harris said that if it was closer in Pennsylvania, she would have considered a recount in both Michigan and Wisconsin. But because the Democratic Party senators held on in those states, I think, and she didn't have the money. She blew through $1 billion, however she did. But we'll be talking about this again in the future. Good evening.
Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause. The cause of democracy.
We are going to raise issues that, historically have not been raised.
What about the nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster? I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised.
All of this is possible for America. Who was standing in the way? Mitch McConnell.
Where an insurrection that sought to overturn an election, when that failed, the action moved into state capitals.
Good evening. So we're going back to immigration issue because this is probably going to be one of the biggest issues in the early months. As you said before, they are going to prioritize the low-hanging fruit, the criminal elements, the human trafficking, the drug issues, the people coming over. What they're going to find, however, according to at least one study, is that most of those criminal operations, the people involved that are of Mexican origin are legal residents because there's more security that way. Just as we've discussed before on this show, and we'll discuss again, the vast majority, if not like 99.9% of the fentanyl coming into this country come through the checkpoints. And more than half of the people bringing fentanyl in to the country are American citizens, and many of them white. So we've got this, all these issues that they want to deal with, the low-hanging fruit. Okay, we get rid of a bunch of criminals, but Trump has also pledged to deport 15 million people of the 20 million people he argues are actually in this country illegally. And that's going to, I mean, you take all of the criminal elements out, you're probably talking about 100,000 at the most that are tied to that, and probably nowhere near that. Not only that, I mean, one of the biggest motivations behind ending birthright citizenship is, despite the results of this last election, in which apparently, according to the exit polls, Latinos may have actually voted, at least Latino men, voted more for Trump than more for Republicans and Trump than the Democrats. Although I think that when we get the further data, it's going to be not quite as extreme as it looked, just as that happened in 2020, when the data where think tanks do examine all of the different regions and their actual voting patterns. It'll generate somewhat different results than the exit polls, which are really hard to get representative samples of. But this is an issue, and it's also a cultural issue. I mean, I remember Patrick Buchanan on the radio, I think was Savage in the 1990s, complaining when salsa had replaced ketchup as the number one condiment. Now, of course, ketchup has more sugar than ice cream. It's not as versatile as salsa, so probably people are going to buy more salsa than ketchup. You use it on burgers and fries and a few other things, and for some barbecue sauces and the rest. But this was an issue to them, and so the idea that we have this cohesive American culture that's going to be disrupted by people who don't have an understanding of Western values is a big issue, and so they're going to want to lower that population to be controllable in terms of votes, certainly in the future, as this is as the Latino vote is the most expanding one of any of the major groups. So one of the things they're going to look at is to whether or not they can prevent birthright citizenship from happening in the future. Now, birthright citizenship is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. It says anybody who was born on the soil and is subject to legal jurisdiction of the United States is a citizen. This was passed to basically overturn the Dred Scott case and guarantee citizenship, to even after the 13th Amendment was passed. But at the time, when they passed the 1866 Civil Rights Act that later formulated into the 14th Amendment, there were three acknowledged groups of people that were not quote unquote under U.S. legal jurisdiction. One was invading military, and the next was anybody that was part of a diplomatic corps. And literally, they're not subject to the jurisdiction. They can commit murder, and they can't be charged unless the country agrees to it. And then at the time, Native Americans who were part of tribal sovereignty and not paying taxes were in that group. There weren't even really laws against illegal immigration at the time, and certainly nothing significant until the Chinese Exclusion Act, a few decades later. And so they didn't even think to make that about part of something. Moreover, you're not really under the legal jurisdiction, because they pay taxes. People who are undocumented immigrants can obtain a tax ID number, not a social security number, but a tax ID number, and they pay into the taxes so that the employers are not in violation of those codes, and in fact, of the tax codes. And in fact, they are paying into Social Security and Medicare, from which they probably will never benefit. So they are under the jurisdiction. But this is why Holman and others want to talk about, and Abbott want to talk about declaring them an invasion, because they want to try to see if they can merge it in with the concept of an invading force to say, well, they're not under the jurisdiction, and therefore, and it's weak, because then we can't arrest them, right? I mean, it's just unless we're going to hold them as prisoners of war, but there's no war. So they're going to have some interesting problems rhetorically. Will the courts, that are jam-packed with Republican appointees right on up to the Supreme Court, give it to them. I don't know. I can't say what they're going to do. They don't seem to respect precedent. But the question is whether or not birthright citizenship is under fire. And then everybody is saying, well, it only applies to future people, not past people. I mean, we've got people in their 80s and 90s who were born here who don't even speak the language of their parents' countries of origin. There were some deportations of people, DACA, people where that was also true. And so, are they going to go after those people, or if they are part of crimes, can they revoke certain crimes? Will they try to revoke the citizenship on that basis? There's nothing off the table. He's not promising he's not going to make it retroactive. He's just saying that he wants to stop it here and now, if to prevent birthright citizenship tourism. Now, birthright citizenship, most countries don't have it. There are about somewhere between 25 and 30 countries that do have it, but it is a unique aspect of the values of America, and what it means, and consistent with the Statue of Liberty that and the poem that the Lazarus poem that's on it. It's just and we're just not that crowded here yet. Anyway, we can get into the practice of it, but the fact of the matter is that birthright citizenship, is it going to be a thing of the past? And can he issue an executive order that will be enforced, and therefore effectively the very first sentence of the 14th Amendment basically overridden, and the precedent which was established by I'm forgetting the name of the case, but a Chinese man who had been born to parents who were here legally, and then left to China, brought back some family, and was not allowed in. He sued and prevailed with the Supreme Court at the time, 1898, I believe the decision was, and that's the precedent that has established birthright citizenship. So that's where we're at. Dave, what have you got?
Yeah, so thank you for that extensive setup. I do really think it's important to key in on that 14th Amendment clause, the history. Basically, I don't think you mentioned it, but the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court said that it was acceptable to deny citizenship to Black Americans. And so, in other words, that you could imagine a scenario where legislators and judges would make mistakes about or not, erring on the side of nativism and xenophobia. Maybe they're not a mistake to them, but from a values judgment perspective, we perceive it as a huge mistake today. In fact, that's why it's enshrined in the 14th Amendment. It was seen as a big mistake back then too. And then so the question is, can these executive orders or other legislation circumvent this constitutional guarantee? Well, we know that it would face challenges in the courts. We're not really sure exactly how the judges would find on this, but it seems nearly impossible to ultimately, not impossible. It seems a far, far reach to find somehow that it's constitutional to rewrite the 14th Amendment short of a constitutional amendment. Now, if they wanted to go that route, that's a very high bar. Constitutional amendment, you need 2/3 of the House and the Representatives and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of the states. That's 38 states. That's not the current climate we live in. It's polarized much more closely to that 50-50 level of like 26 states, I think, for the abortion topic, we're on the side of some radical conservative changes to constitutionality. And then so I looked up one immigration lawyer's perspective was that it's not just a technicality here. This is a fundamental principle of inclusion. So in other words, why does it matter? Historically, and he pointed to stripping individuals of citizenship leads to catastrophic consequences. So Nazi Germany passed Nuremberg laws revoking the citizenship of Jewish people. That once that was enshrined in their law, that set the stage for the Holocaust. And this person points out not that we need to devolve to Nazism and Hitler, projections or anything, but the reality is that it serves as a cautionary tale that the undermining citizenship rights and importance of vigilance. This is what he said when such discussions even arise. So the fact that we're talking about it, we really need to point to the fact that there's a very good reason why we have this in our laws now. And then one last thing I'll mention too is that the idea that we're going to break up families, in some kind of, like you had mentioned, like a backwards looking way, that basically it goes counter to our values when people are trying to work hard and play by the rules, but they're brought over here as children, or worse, they're actually born here. Somebody who's born here, that is by the rules 100%. Now you're trying to change the rules in a reactionary way. So I know that this administration does have some philosophical underpinnings of being neo-reactionaries, and they're we'll talk more about that later. But this truly is a highly contentious line in the sand that I think that upholding American values, 150, 170-year legacy of that will probably be one of the most contentious conversations that we have.
Well, and the fact is, let me just read the text, all right? We're talking about the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This is pretty straightforward, unambiguous language. And you would think that Clarence Thomas, who is supposedly a textualist and an original intentionalist, would look at the sentence and say, yes, that if you're born here and you're under this jurisdiction, and would look to the language of the time. He believes, for instance, that the Eighth Amendment should be governed by the time in which it was passed, which means that we put people in stocks at the time. It hangs people in frontier justice at the time. He says that since it was representing the values and the policies of the time that the Eighth Amendment was passed, that's what guides us and not modern times. He did very much against the evolving document of the more liberal line, but this would require them to say, well, okay, this wasn't a recognized exception at the time, but times have evolved, and so they would have to open that up to say, this is what it means to be under the jurisdiction. That's a much different situation. With that happening, they would, in order for the Supreme Court to basically go along with what Trump wants, they would have to abandon judicial conservative principles, both textualism and original intent, because it is clearly not there. There wasn't talks of illegal immigration problems at the time in 1866 or 1868. It just wasn't even an issue. People came and left all the time. It didn't become an issue until, unfortunately, labor and other organizations pushed for a limit of immigration because the increased labor numbers were lowering the value of work and making it harder for unions to negotiate better wages. Kind of a mixed opinion here, because if they apply textual or evolving document principles, maybe you can make the argument that it's not a jurisdiction, but then you got to not be able to arrest them. You can't charge them taxes. That's what it means to be in the jurisdiction, is you can't charge them without permission from their original country. So the Kavanaugh and Roberts wing, the two of the conservatives, have to really think about this and what type of precedent they'd be setting if they go along with Trump on this.
Yeah, I would just add that, one of the main premises here that this whole sort of reactionary immigration paradigm, the whole enterprise that we're experiencing, not just birthright citizenship, but the idea that it's really a fundamental part of national security to deport folks. Part of that is saying, look, that there's some correlation between being an undocumented person or even an immigrant and crime. There are many studies out there that show that, in fact, there's not a relationship there. So I think that the general, high level takeaway that I saw was, as the population of immigrants in the country doubled between 1980 and 2022, we saw a decline in half of crime overall. And then when you broke it out by state, all 50 states, there are no states in which you saw, the proportion of immigrants rise and then some increase in crime that's got some relation to that. So in other words, there's not, it's In fact, it's the opposite, that the areas with more states with more higher immigrant population tend to not have higher crimes, and in fact that population commits less crimes than the overall population of people that live there. It's a little technical, but it's just, the point is that it's like that whole premise, the whole idea of saying, well, if these people are here, this is going to be the consequence. It's really quite the opposite from a criminal perspective. And when it comes to an economic perspective, I don't think people realize quite how many people in the workforce are in fact undocumented and how many are immigrants. There's a report from the Labor Department that shows like 4 dozen different sectors of the economy where immigrant population makes up between 10% and 50% of those workers. And in some cases, then it says the estimated percentage of people that are actually undocumented, and it's 10 to 20% of those workers are undocumented. So it's really the case that communities across the country, huge portions of the population are immigrant, large portions of the population are undocumented, but they are contributing to the economy, and it would be massively disruptive to continue to have factually inaccurate biases of nativism and xenophobia driving policy without more thoughtful application.
All right, and real quickly, one of the studies you're referring to actually is promoted by the Cato Institute, a Libertarian Party study, and the Libertarians tend to ally with the left on this particular issue, and it shows that immigrants have a lower crime rate than citizens, and although the lowest of three groups is the legal residents, probably because they have the most to lose. So it's we'll be discussing this. This will be a major topic come next year as to whether or not Trump follows through or not.
Yeah.
Good evening. Well, that brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
Well, following up on that last segment where we talked a little bit about the plan for the Trump administration to implement this immigration deportation policy, there has already been pushback from the U.S. farm sector, lobbying heavily with the representatives of Trump's incoming administration, just basically letting it be known how much this potentially could upset the whole food supply chain and also the economies of farm communities across the country. So the general estimate that they put on it is that about 2 million farm workers lack legal status. Half of the nation's 2 million farm workers lack legal status. Now, no matter how you cut it, even if it was the case that they decided they were going to target those million people, we would see that vacuum in best case filled by American workers that would demand higher wages, which would mean much higher cost of all farm products in America, not just that we consume locally, but those that we export. So it would reduce competitiveness internationally of the entire agriculture sector, dairy sector, meat sector. It would, the anticipated massive disruption to the global food supply, but more importantly for our purposes, the domestic food supply. It just seems to be an immense a case of the tail wagging the dog. We'll see how it plays out, but my prediction today is that we will see a much more tightly focused criminal targeting of this administration, and that there will be accommodation for people that have worked in this country for some period of time, knowing that the disruption, the cost would be too much to bear.
Well, given what Trump has to do for his politics too, is all he has to say is, "Hey, we've deported over 1 million people." And certain people will just believe him because he says it. But we'll take that. Well, I'm going to take it a step further on the topic we just talked about. I do believe that the 10th Amendment protection Kavanaugh, he may be a rapist, but he is definitely a judicial conservative to the core. And I think they would be worried about the impact on the 10th Amendment as a precedent if they were to override the sanctuary cities, if they were to basically abolish sanctuary cities, because the 10th Amendment is what protects big business across the board. They prevents federal laws from infringing too much onto their interests. So I think that is going to happen, and I think the same thing with birthright citizenship. I don't think that maybe even Clarence Thomas will vote against it because he very strongly is a textualist and originalist. Although the cognitive dissonance can have people do anything, but I believe that the 14th Amendment will remain intact as well as the 10th Amendment in their decisions about about birthright citizenship and sanctuary cities. We'll find out if I'm right. Maybe I'm too optimistic here, but until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. And we'll talk to you next week. Probably next week, we're going to talk about tariffs because it's a similar issue.
It is